Bienvenue à tous. Welcome to Reporters here on France 24. I'm Mark Owen. In November 2022, thousands of young Chinese people took to the streets to protest against the government's zero-COVID policy. They no longer saw the need for repeated lockdowns and constant PCR tests. Protests broke out in several cities simultaneously. It was a situation that seemed unimaginable in China's one-party state. Two things happened. One was predictable. The protests were squashed. But then came the surprise. The zero-COVID policy was scrapped. Let's get more on China's lockdown generation. Yana Li is our correspondent who joins us now. Yana, tell us how these protests started.
The protests were triggered after a tragic fire in Durumqi in western China in Xinjiang province. 10 people lost their lives on November 24th, and locals blamed lockdown policies, saying that was the reason why emergency services couldn't reach these people and save more lives. And protests started quite immediately afterwards in that region. And you have to remember that at the time, Xinjiang province was under a strict lockdown for over 3 months. It was one of the longest, if not the longest, lockdown that the country had seen, and news about this fire spread online despite censorship, and young people across the nation started showing up on university campuses and on street corners to hold vigils to mourn the dead. And these vigils transformed into anti-lockdown protests, where you started hearing people shouting and demanding more freedom. And this really is something that was quite unexpected and unheard of in contemporary China.
Yana, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a look then at our report from China by Lou Kisiela, Antoine Morel and Chen.
The angry cries of an exasperated generation, fed up with zero-COVID policies, and some even fed up with the Communist Party. At the end of November 2022, these slogans were heard in the streets of Shanghai, Beijing, and several other cities, scenes we hadn't witnessed since the student movement of 1989. Daring to defy Chinese authorities seems unthinkable, but for a brief moment, a spontaneous, leaderless movement was born. The security apparatus shut it down in less than 3 days. 1 week later, Beijing dismantled its zero-COVID policy. But the roots of the malaise run deeper than lockdowns. In a country where censorship is rife and where criticism is severely punished, why did thousands of young people revolt? What are the reasons behind this anger, this affront to Xi Jinping's authority? Since the protests, police have been rounding up participants, effectively discouraging them from speaking up. But this Shanghai resident wants to tell us his side of the story. For his safety, we have blurred his face.
The protest was peaceful. On our side, no one crossed the line. But as soon as you got closer to the site, you'd get arrested. The police suddenly and violently took people away. At that moment, we were all so scared.
That evening, he avoided arrest, but one of his friends spent 2 nights in jail. The crackdown has left many in fear.
It would be very difficult to recreate such a form of resistance. In other parts of the world, it's normal to express your demands. But in our country, we can't voice our opposition. Debate is impossible. I feel powerless, completely powerless, though I still want to fight back a bit.
If this young man dares to voice such thoughts, it's because he was fed up and traumatized by the Shanghai lockdown, one that lasted more than 2 months. At the time, he lost his source of income and slept on the streets for weeks.
I had to sleep outside because I was living in a hotel and I couldn't pay for it anymore. So they threw me out. Outside, I saw things that people who were locked down at home wouldn't even be able to imagine. So many people were sleeping on the streets. I heard people screaming. I heard people saying they wanted to die.
The harsh COVID-19 lockdowns have left a mark on a whole generation. Just when they were getting their first taste of independence, hundreds of millions of Chinese youth were forced to stay indoors. University campuses turned into zero-COVID fortresses, cut off from the rest of the world. From March to June 2022, students in Shanghai weren't even allowed to leave their dorms. This student gives us a tour of what that meant. We have concealed her identity.
So here's our dorm room. There are 4 of us who live here. The beds are on top, and we keep our clothes and shoes underneath. The desks are on the left of the beds.
4 women in 20 square meters for 3 months. It's here where they tuned into their online classes and here where they had their food delivered. Only the curtains around their beds offered them any sort of privacy.
Sitting on this chair at my desk, every day with my face to the wall, life was monotonous and boring. Of course, there were moments when we couldn't find the motivation to work and study, when we had the impression that there was nothing to hope for or expect in life.
It was a difficult time for this young woman and her peers. According to one study, more than 80% of students in Shanghai suffer from depression and anxiety.
At the time, I was so lonely. I also felt the other students suffering. The only thing they told us was to hold on. Psychologically, we were left on our own.
Criticizing the drastic health restrictions put them at risk of punishment. So students on locked-down campuses found other ways to de-stress. These images went viral on social media. We see students crawling on all fours, others taking cardboard pets out for a walk. This wasn't just an online trend, but also a way to criticize the absurdity of their situation. Since the end of COVID restrictions, campuses have reopened. Our interviewee can now study wherever she wants, but most of her classes are still online, and she won't be forgetting what she lived through anytime soon.
We need to keep up this anger against the injustice and the unreasonable policies that we had to live through. Otherwise, we have no chance of changing the future.
This desire for change is perhaps more common among the urban and educated middle class. These views are thus marginal, but they still worry the Communist Party, which is obsessed with social stability. President Xi Jinping ended his New Year's speech with a message directly addressed to young generations.
China's youth should develop their dedication to the nation and to the pursuit of progress, in order to be worthy of both the times we live in and the hopeful generation they represent.
The problem is, the Chinese dream is in trouble. Growth is slowing down, increasing at just 3% in 2022, the lowest in decades. The economy is in a slump, and in big cities, almost 1 young person in 6 is unemployed. After years of rapid growth, even big tech companies have started mass layoffs. Xiaobai has just been fired by a video streaming giant, the Chinese equivalent of YouTube, and this wasn't her first layoff.
I've had 3 jobs in the past 4 years. The first one lasted 2 years, the next 2 about 1 year each before I was fired.
Without a steady income, she could no longer pay rent in Shanghai, and the 28-year-old had to move back to her parents' home. From internet giants to startups, none of her former employers could afford to keep her. The tech industry is suffering from the pandemic and the 2021 government crackdown. For Xiaobai, the sector has become unsustainable for employees.
I'd clock in at 10 a.m. and I wouldn't leave the office until 9 or 10 p.m. Competition was intense. We all worked late to show the boss how productive we were, to hold on to our jobs. Everyone was so anxious.
Today she earns a bit of money thanks to short-term projects. The number of freelancers like Xiaobai has tripled in China to 200 million in 2021. But it's not a form of work that's respected by older generations. Back in her small hometown, the only child is under a lot of social pressure.
My family still hopes that I'll be able to find a stable job. What matters most to them is being able to say that I have a real job to their entourage. Freelancing, for them, is like being a parasite. It doesn't leave a good impression.
For some young people, the future is no longer in China. Emigration queries on search engines have spiked, but because the topic is sensitive, Chinese netizens have come up with a new term, runrunshui, runology, or the study of running away.
In Chinese, the character run means humidity, but it is pronounced not unlike the English word run. So it's practical to use it to refer to emigration or the desire to leave.
Sarah wants to move to Canada with her boyfriend. She plans on leaving in less than a year.
I was thinking of leaving even before the Shanghai lockdown, but I didn't have this much determination until now. I've studied and lived abroad before. I know what life and normal social organization can be like in the rest of the world. Here, the general climate makes me feel like I'm on a boat that's about to sink.
Leaving China, Shanghai, and her loved ones is a heart-wrenching decision, one that she sometimes struggles to explain. Her parents are former civil servants, loyal to the party, meaning conversations can be difficult.
My parents have a lot of prejudice about foreign countries because they are very conservative and traditional in their way of thinking. I told them about my desire to emigrate, but I can't explain my reasoning to them in detail. This is because they think that no country in the world is as good or as safe as China.
Sarah has made her mind up. She cannot see her future in China.
I can't be my parents' prisoner all my life. I don't want to have a child that's born and raised in China. I think that for the next generation, to have a better environment to live in, it's worth it to leave.
Since the end of the zero-COVID policy, some young Chinese people are eager to get back to their normal lives. But for Sarah and for many others, there simply is no going back.
Yenna Lee is still with us. So Yenna, in the report we hear about how the authorities reacted to the protests. Tell us some more about that.
Well, state censors tried to scrub the internet of any trace of those protests. There were also reports of police conducting stop and searches amongst young people to check if they had any footage of those protests on their mobile phone. And as we heard in that report, there have been arrests, people who were stopped during those protests, but also in the aftermath. Now, it's really difficult to gauge just how many people have been sent to jail over this. What I can tell you is here in Beijing, one group of friends has been detained, a group of young professional women, and at least two of them have been formally charged. One of those women actually filmed a video of herself before she was taken away.
If you see this video, I have been taken away by the police, like my other friends. They had to sign blank arrest warrants. Police refused to say how long they will be detained for, where, and why.
That was the voice of Chao Jixin speaking there. Her friends describe her as rather an ordinary, normal woman, rather bookish, and not at all a political activist or a militant. And it really goes to show that any sign of dissent here in China, it still is a rather risky affair.
Let's hope there's news soon of Chao Jixin. People who speak out in China, we know, can live to regret it. Journalists, obviously, who are asking awkward questions and won't take no for an answer, can come up against some opposition. It must make life difficult for the media.
Indeed, because of this climate, a lot of the people who took part in those protests don't want to speak publicly about it, and understandably so. My colleagues who filmed this report told me that many of the people they had contacted refused to speak on the record. There's a lot of mistrust towards foreign media. There's also a lot of fear about reprisals from officials. And of course, television isn't an easy medium when it comes to sensitive topics. It's a lot more difficult and a lot less discreet compared to a radio or the printed press. In the end, in that report we just saw there, and most of the faces had to be blurred out because, of course, it is extremely important to protect the anonymity of our sources.
Indeed, that is a basic tenet of our occupation. Yenna, thank you very much indeed. You can see our report on China's zero COVID generation again via our website, France24.com. This is Reporters on France 24. Stay with us.